The sea was restless that morning, its waves rising and falling against the Egyptian coast like the slow breathing of a god. Salt filled the air. Gulls circled above a stretch of pale sand where a new city was about to be born. No one knew its name yet, only that it would outshine every city that came before. A young conqueror had dreamed it, Alexander the Great, child of Macedonia, student of Aristotle, wanderer between worlds. He had cut through Persia, through deserts and mountains, through civilizations older than memory, and yet, even as his armies conquered, his heart remained fixed on something far gentler than empire. He wanted a city that would endure not by the sword, but by the mind. When he stood on that wind-bitten shore in 331 BCE, he drew its shape into the sand with the end of his spear. He called it Alexandria. He said it would be the place where the knowledge of all peoples would meet, the wisdom of Greece, the faith of Egypt, the stars of Babylon, the geometry of India, a crossroads for the human soul. He would never see it finished. Within a few years he was gone. Fever, exhaustion, the gods taking back what they had lent. But his dream did not die with him. It passed like a torch to one of his generals, Ptolemy Soter, who made Egypt his kingdom and Alexandria his throne. The city began to rise, white marble against blue sea, avenues wider than any in the world, a lighthouse so tall that sailors called it the sun-made stone. And within its heart, Ptolemy planned something stranger than palaces or pyramids, a temple not to a god, but to understanding. He called it the Mausion, the shrine of the muses. It would be a sanctuary where poets, mathematicians, physicians, and astronomers might live, study, and dream together. Attached to it, he ordered the creation of a library, an archive of every scroll ever written, every voice ever recorded on papyrus. He commanded that ships entering the harbor must surrender any texts they carried. The scribes of Alexandria would copy them, painstakingly, reverently, and return the duplicates while keeping the originals. Slowly, the library began to grow like coral beneath clear water. Its shelves reached higher each year, its rooms filled with the smell of ink and oil lamps, cedar wood and sea wind. The scholars who worked there called it the soul of the world. They believed that if all knowledge could be gathered in one place, humanity might finally understand the order of creation, the pattern hidden behind chaos. They dreamed of charting the stars, mapping the earth, measuring time, unlocking the secrets of medicine and the mind. To them, learning was not pride, it was devotion. At night, when the torches flickered along the marble corridors, one could hear the scratch of quills like rain, the murmur of voices debating beneath frescoes of the 9 muses. Poets from Athens read beside priests from Memphis. Engineers argued with philosophers. Ideas collided like comets, and from their collisions came light. Imagine walking those halls, scrolls stacked from floor to ceiling, each one a heartbeat from another age. Titles written in faded ink, On the Nature of the Stars, Treatise on Harmony, Journeys Beyond the Indus. Each scroll a bridge between worlds, between minds that would never meet except here, in this sanctuary by the sea. Outside, Alexandria pulsed with life. Markets crowded with spices from Arabia, glass from Phoenicia, silk from the East. Students from faraway lands crowded the steps of the Mausion, carrying clay tablets, eager to trade what they knew for what they might learn. They spoke in many tongues, but knowledge was their common language. To live in Alexandria was to live at the center of everything, where the desert met the ocean, where the old gods whispered to the new. The city glowed at night, its lighthouse flame mirrored on the waves, and travelers approaching from the sea would say it looked as if the stars themselves had descended to rest upon the earth. But the narrator's voice softens here almost to a whisper, because every light casts a shadow. The dream that Alexander began was a fragile one. The same hunger that built the library would one day destroy it, the hunger to own knowledge, to command it, to wield it like power. Even in these golden days, the seeds of envy had already been planted. Yet for now, in this moment, the dream still breathes. There is an old story told by the scholars of the Maussan. One evening, a young student asked his teacher why they collected so many scrolls when no single lifetime could read them all. The teacher smiled and replied, "Because truth is not meant to be owned, it is meant to be remembered." That answer stayed with the boy, and perhaps it stayed with the city too. For even as the centuries would turn and the world would change, Alexandria's first heartbeat was that belief that knowledge could be a kind of immortality. The sea outside the walls seems to know it. Its waves whisper against the harbor stones, a soft rhythm like the turning of pages. Ships drift in from distant ports, their sails heavy with stories, and above it all, the great lighthouse keeps its steady watch, guiding the lost home to the place where learning never sleeps. The camera of the mind drifts upward now, over the rooftops of marble, over the gardens filled with date palms and olive trees, over the courtyards where students debate beneath the statues of philosophers. From this height, the library looks endless, rows of columns fading into shadow as if it might continue beyond the horizon. The wind carries the faint scent of papyrus and salt. It smells of beginnings, and somewhere within those endless halls, a scholar lights a lamp and unrolls a fresh scroll. On it is written a single line in Greek, "Let us seek what lies behind the stars." The flame flickers, the scroll unrolls further, and in that moment, before politics, before invasion, before the long centuries of forgetting, Alexandria's dream is pure. The world believes, for the first and perhaps only time, that wisdom can save it. The sound of the harbor is like a heartbeat, steady, endless. Ships from every corner of the world drift toward the docks of Alexandria, their sails glowing in the morning light like wings. On their decks are not only merchants and sailors, but scholars, wanderers, seekers. Some carry scrolls wrapped in linen, others only questions they hope the city can answer. Alexandria has become more than a city. It is an idea made of marble and wind. From the lighthouse of Pharos, its flame burns day and night, visible for miles across the Mediterranean. To sailors it means safety, but to the people of Alexandria it means something greater, illumination. That light belongs to the library, to the belief that no piece of knowledge, no matter how small, should ever be lost again. Walking through the streets, you would hear dozens of languages at once: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, Latin. The air smells of oil and ink, of parchment drying in the sun, of salt from the sea and smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Every wall is carved with inscriptions, every alley filled with arguments. Scholars gather in courtyards reciting theories about the stars or the nature of the soul. Philosophers lean over amphorae of wine, debating the weight of air. Poets read their verses aloud to anyone who will listen, their words echoing between columns. The whole city hums with the sound of thought, and in the heart of it all stands the Library of Alexandria. It is not one building, but a constellation of them, long halls lined with papyrus scrolls, lecture courts, observatories, botanical gardens, and laboratories where strange experiments are carried out under lamplight. At night, the glow from its windows spills into the streets like gold. They say if you stand outside its doors long enough, you can hear the sea and the whispers of 10,000 scrolls breathing together. Inside, time itself seems to slow. The ceilings are high, painted with constellations. The floors are polished white stone. The air is cool, thick with the faint scent of cedar and parchment. Along the walls, scribes bend over tables, copying texts by hand in perfect silence. Their quills scratch like the soft rhythm of rain. Every scroll is precious. Some have come from Greece, philosophical treatises by Plato and Aristotle, others from Babylon and Persia, astronomical records, formulas, maps of stars. Egyptian texts describe the movements of the Nile, the rituals of ancient gods. From India come ideas of numbers and infinity. From distant China, rumors of medicine and invention. No empire has ever gathered so much in one place. When a new ship docks at the port, the scholars of the library are the first to greet it. The sailors know the rule. Any scroll, tablet, or text found aboard must be surrendered. The library scribes copy it carefully and only then return the original, or sometimes quietly keep it for preservation. The collection grows faster than anyone can count. The legend says there are over 500,000 scrolls stored in Alexandria's library at its height. No one knows the exact number. Perhaps no one ever will, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what it represents. A world no longer divided by ignorance. Imagine what it must have felt like to be there, to walk into a hall filled with centuries of human thought. The hum of voices, the scratching of quills, the sound of sandals on marble, the awareness that you are standing inside something larger than any one life. And at the center of that living network are the scholars themselves, the guardians of knowledge. Some study the heavens, mapping the movements of stars on parchment that glows faintly in lamplight. They argue about the distance between Earth and the Sun, about whether our planet truly stands still. Others study medicine, cutting open cadavers to understand the body's hidden machinery. Some whisper of invisible forces, air pressure, magnetism, numbers that stretch beyond counting. They are dreamers, all of them. And yet, within these walls, dreaming is not madness. It is duty. There are stories of small miracles in this place. A scholar watching his shadow at noon realizes the sun strikes differently at the same hour hundreds of miles to the south. From this, he calculates the circumference of the earth, Eratosthenes, using only light, shadow, and reason. Another man studies the rising smoke of incense and imagines invisible particles moving through air. Another designs an instrument of glass and water to measure time by dripping. Every discovery leads to another. Knowledge multiplies like life itself. But what gives the library its soul is not what it contains, it's what it represents. To study in Alexandria is to believe that understanding the world is a sacred act. Here, philosophy is not luxury, it is survival. Here, curiosity is not rebellion, it is devotion. Students write prayers before unrolling a scroll. They call upon the muses, the daughters of memory, to bless their hands and minds. To them, reading is not a task. It is a ritual, a form of communion with those who came before. When dusk falls, the scholars gather in the courtyard of the Maison, the great temple of learning that houses the library. Torches burn in tall stands. Musicians play soft notes on lyres. A cool wind drifts in from the harbor, carrying the smell of the sea and distant incense. They share food, bread, figs, honeyed wine. Then the debates begin. Laughter, argument, reverence. They speak of the gods, of mathematics, of poetry, of the meaning of justice. They argue about whether the stars are fixed or alive, whether human fate is written or free. It is a place where the world's greatest minds can disagree without fear. Or so it seems. Because beneath the marble and light, something else is growing, something quiet and invisible. Envy, rivalry, ambition. Knowledge, for all its beauty, carries danger. The same information that enlightens can also empower. And power, as always, draws those who wish to control it. Rumors spread that the library keeps forbidden texts, scrolls on sorcery, forbidden religions, secrets of kings. Foreign rulers send spies to copy its records. Philosophers compete for favor, accusing one another of heresy. Priests murmur that the pursuit of knowledge offends the gods. The library, built as a temple of unity, begins to echo with the noise of division. Still, on the surface, life goes on. Eratosthenes continues to teach geography, mapping the world as if to prove that the earth itself can be understood. Callimachus writes the first catalogue of books, the Pentateuch, an attempt to list and order every known scroll. It is the world's first organized library index. New thinkers arrive daily: poets, engineers, mystics, mathematicians. Even kings send gifts, rare texts, maps, instruments. The library becomes not just a place of learning, but of prestige. To be associated with it is to be immortal, and yet you can sense the fragility in the air, the way one feels the tremor before an earthquake. Because when something becomes this great, this vast, this full of light, the darkness notices. Outside the city walls, the world grows restless. Rome, expanding westward, eyes Egypt's wealth. Pirates haunt the trade routes. Famine spreads in distant provinces. Inside, the Ptolemaic kings grow suspicious of the scholar's influence. Knowledge makes them uneasy. It gives power to words, to truth, to ideas they cannot control. But within the library's walls, the scholars carry on. They believe the light of reason is strong enough to outshine politics. They believe that curiosity will always triumph. At night, when the torches burn low, a young student sits alone in one of the side chambers. He writes by the light of a single lamp, his quill trembling over the page. He has just read something that changes the way he sees the world, a theory about the movement of the stars that contradicts everything he was taught. He feels both terror and wonder. He looks around at the thousands of scrolls surrounding him, and he realizes that no one person, not even the most brilliant, could ever hold all this. The library is larger than human understanding itself, and in that moment, something profound settles in his chest. Maybe that's the point. The library is not meant to be finished. It is not meant to be mastered. It is meant to remind us that knowledge is endless and that we are small. The student dips his quill again, smiling faintly. Outside, the waves crash against the harbor. The lighthouse flame sways in the wind, reflected on the sea like a second sun. Alexandria sleeps, but it dreams of knowing everything. The world, for a moment, seems at peace. No one knows that this is the peak before the fall, the moment before history inhales and holds its breath. The library glows like gold against the dark horizon, its scrolls safe, its minds unafraid, and somewhere in that endless maze of wisdom, a candle flickers beside a forgotten shelf, its flame trembling as if it already knows what is coming. The library did not breathe through papyrus alone, it breathed through people. If you stood in its courtyards at noon, the sun throwing clean light across the colonnades, you would hear the murmur of minds at work, voices weaving across languages and lifetimes. What looks from a distance like marble and order was up close a living tide of curiosity. Here, knowledge did not sit still on shelves. It walked, argued, laughed, doubted, and began again. A young scribe once wrote that the Mausion sounded like rain. He meant the scratch of reeds on papyrus, the soft shuffle of sandals, the clink of bronze instruments being set down beside bowls of water and trays of sand. But it was more than sound. It was the feeling of something steady and cleansing moving through a place, of minds being rinsed and made new. The library's golden generation did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived as 1,000 small beginnings. In a shaded hall near the gardens, a middle-aged scholar with a spare frame and patient eyes arranged 2 sticks in the earth. He had already walked the length of Alexandria that morning, long enough to learn where his own shadow liked to hide. His name was Eratosthenes, and he loved questions that other men dismissed as too large to hold. He waited until the sun lifted to its height, then noted, with the care of a jeweler, how the light fell here, straight as a plumb line, and how, on this same day, far to the south in Siene, a deep well would show no shadow at all. The earth, he reasoned, could not be flat if shadows changed so cleanly with distance. Measure the angle here, know the distance there, multiply the earth by the angle of light. He did not need to circle the world to size it. He only needed a thinking mind and faithful sun. When he finished his calculation, he closed his eyes and smiled the way a man smiles when a door opens exactly where he guessed there might be one. He had weighed the planet without leaving the city. The number he wrote down would be argued over for centuries, imprecise to some, astonishingly close to others. What mattered to him was not the last integer, but the method. That reason could stretch its hand across deserts and feel the shape of the world. Around the corner, in a room lit by high windows, a lean teacher traced triangles in lampblack on smooth boards. "Begin with what cannot be doubted," he told the boys gathered at his feet. The teacher was Euclid, and doubt was his closest friend. He did not gather facts. He built axioms, foundations so modest and clean that a house of thought could rise upon them forever. From such small beginnings, elements took shape, an architecture of proof. Lines, angles, circles, figures, theorems, each one placed where it must go, not by decree, but by necessity. When a student, impatient, asked if there was a quicker way to learn geometry, Euclid is said to have called for coins and told the servant to pay the boy, since he requires profit of what should be pure. It may be legend, but it rings like truth. In Alexandria, understanding was its own reward. In another wing, a woman's voice guided students through the names of nerves and vessels. Herophilus had begun this work, and Erasistratus with him, men who were rash enough or brave enough to ask what lay beneath the skin and refused to be satisfied with metaphor. With knives, careful, respectful, terrible, they opened the body's doors. They found the pulsing paths of blood, the puzzles of the brain's folded valleys. Where poets spoke of spirits, they spoke of structure, not to banish wonder, but to ground it. Their language was not blasphemy here. It was reverence with sharper edges. The air in those rooms was different, the iron smell of knowing what life is made of, and the silence that comes when students feel both awe and a little fear. At night, in the observatory above the gardens, a pair of astronomers climbed the narrow stairs with oil lamps cupped in their hands. Timocharis and Aristillus were not princes among scholars. They were craftsmen, recording the rise and fall of stars with a devotion that bordered on prayer. They noted where each bright point stood against the blackness, night after night, for years. Their tables later fed the genius of men they would never meet. Such is the library's quiet law. No mind stands alone. Every brilliance is built of earlier embers. Sometimes news arrived not as people, but as letters, packages sealed with wax, salt crusted on the cords from sea air. From Syracuse came missives carrying the impatient intelligence of Archimedes. He wrote, as one writes to brothers, sketches of spirals, levers long enough to move the world, floating bodies finding their level. He posed problems like riddles and laughed when answers took years to ripen. In one letter, he described a device of mirrors that could bend sunlight into a spear. In another, he swore that with the right fulcrum and a place to stand, he could shift the earth. Alexandria loved him for his audacity, even when she suspected he was teasing. The joy was in the reach. Downstairs, at a long table like an altar, a poet-librarian lifted a stylus and divided the ocean. Callimachus did with words what engineers did with stone. He made order where chaos wanted to reign. His Pinnaces, vast catalogues mapping authors' work subjects, was an act of mercy for tired eyes and seeking hearts. The library had grown so enormous that without such a map, its riches threatened to drown the very minds that came to drink. He refused to worship size. A big book is a big evil, he wrote, not to curse knowledge, but to plead for precision. In a city trying to know everything, he taught the art of choosing what matters. The Mousillon did not keep its excellence in separate jars. It mixed them. In the botanical gardens, mathematicians kept company with herbalists. In lecture courts, physicians quoted poets. An engineer might step out from a lesson in hydraulics to watch a philosopher argue that justice has a shape. In the refectory, one could sit at a table where a translator of Hebrew listened to an Egyptian priest compare myths while a geographer sketched a coastline into the condensation of his wine cup. You could feel just sitting there how knowledge braided itself tighter each time two strangers were brave enough to be curious about one another. A courier once brought into the harbor a chest so heavy 4 men strained to carry it up the steps. Inside were scrolls taken from a ship blown off course, texts of medicine gathered in Asia Minor, a set of plays lost even to Athens, a treatise on numbers that spoke obliquely of nothingness, what we now call zero, whispered across languages like a superstition. The scribes unpacked the chest the way families unpack heirlooms, quiet, smiling, tender. Each roll was a voice saved from drowning. The city built instruments to serve its hunger. In a courtyard, a gentle scholar named Ctesibius watched water fall and rise and began to tame time with fountains and air. He made clocks that hissed and sighed, organs that sang by pressure alone, pumps that pulled what once only gravity could command. In another workshop, Hero, or his teacher's teacher, played with valves and steam, making toys that spun with invisible force. Some laughed and called them curiosities. Others blinked and glimpsed for a heartbeat the future's face. A boy no older than 15 once wandered into the zoological enclosures and found, beside cages of birds and hyenas, an old scholar teaching 2 apprentices how to weigh the soul of air. They inverted bowls and basins and watched bubbles rise from the trapped space as if something living were fleeing. "You cannot see it," the old man said, "but it presses upon us as surely as the sea does upon a swimmer." The boy's eyes widened. Even our emptiness has weight. He ran home and could not sleep for the thrill of it. The library's power was not that it kept answers. It kept methods. It taught a way of being in the world. Begin with humble things. Watch carefully. Ask better. Be willing to be wrong. Write what you find so that someone unborn may test you without having to trust you. It was a covenant across time. Of course, there were tempers. Great minds do not always come with gentle manners. In the catalog room, 2 grammarians once shouted for an hour over which Homeric epithet deserved precedence. One of them, red with victory, later tucked a rival's work into a shelf so obscure no hand found it for years. In the lecture court, a philosopher accused a physician of mistaking the living for a machine. The physician called the philosopher a poet too afraid to open his own body to find the truth he praised. And still, after the sting, they ate from the same dish and went back to their work. No one claimed to love knowledge and then fled its quarrels. The city's rulers watched all of this with mixed hearts. The Ptolemies funded stipends and feasts. They basked in the prestige of being father to such a place. Yet power is a jealous god. When scholars praised reason above ritual, some priests frowned. When poets lampooned a prince's vanity, the prince laughed, until he did not. There were days when the library felt invincible, and others when it felt like a glass of clear water balanced on a nervous hand. Even in its confidence, the library kept a tenderness for the small. A scribe named Miriam, her name survives in a margin, copied a text 3 times in one winter because every time she finished, she found some error too subtle for anyone else to care about. She wrote to the next copyist down the chain, "Forgive my hand. I wanted it to be as clean as the idea." In another role, a note appears from a translator. "This word will not be forced into Greek without losing its soul. I leave it as it is and ask the reader to lean toward it." These are not the triumphs that make statues. They are the quiet stubbornness that keeps civilizations honest. Some afternoons, when the sea breeze was right and the gulls were merciful, classes spilled into the garden. You could see, beneath date palms, a semicircle of students listening to a lecturer draw a circle in the dust and prove, with nothing but words and the patience of a saint, that the angles within it added up to a certainty that no king could edit. Truth, in these moments, felt like a public fountain, clear, shared, inexhaustible. Letters came as well from places that would never kneel to Alexandria, and the library welcomed them like cousins. From the banks of the Euphrates, Babylonian star priests sent records of eclipses written long before Homer sang. From Jewish scholars came translations and commentaries, the first scaffolds of what would become a scripture in many tongues. From India, hints of a numberless arithmetic and medicines drawn from bark and seed. The library did not erase the world's accents, it harmonized them. When disaster struck, the small kind every city knows, the fire in the dye market, the fever that licked through 2 streets, the scholars did not retreat to their scrolls as if hiding behind them. The physicians went out with bandages and herbs. The engineers inspected broken aqueducts. The astronomers told frightened mothers that no bad star had called this upon them. It was simply the way of living things, to sicken, to heal, to mourn. Reason was not a cold thing here, it was a hand offered. At evening, lamps lit the colonnades in lines like constellations brought down to human height. A visiting poet from Rhodes, Apollonius, read to a small crowd his tale of a voyage, and some swore the room itself tilted with the sea as he spoke. After him, a young woman recited a fragment she had restored from a torn scroll, her voice stitching the missing rhythm with courage. When applause subsided, an old mathematician stood and thanked them both. "We measure different infinities," he said. "Yours are not less." If you asked in those years what Alexandria was for, some would have said, to keep the world from forgetting itself. Others, to tame the chaos with names. A few, more honest, to make us worthy of what we already half know. No one said, to last forever. They knew better. Nothing lasts forever. But some things teach us how to live while we have them, and those are the treasures worth any ransom. And so the men and women who measured the world did not only measure distances and masses. They measured ignorance against patience, fear against the courage to look, myth against meaning, and found, again and again, ways to balance the scales. They failed often. They disagreed loudly. They doubted, corrected, began again. That was the point. In Alexandria, certainty was not an idol. It was a horizon that moved as you approached, reminding you to keep walking. No one in those sun-white corridors could hear the hoof beat still far beyond the deserts, or the creak of empire at its joints, or the murmur of a new faith rising like dawn behind hills the library had not yet mapped. They stood for this hour in a rare peace, flawed, human, luminous. In the cool of one late night, Eratosthenes passed Euclid's hall and paused. A student inside, alone, was practicing a proof by lamplight, whispering the steps the way a pilgrim whispers prayers. The older scholar did not enter. He watched, smiling, and then went on. Across a courtyard, a physician closed a body gently and covered it with linen, then stood for a time beneath the stars, looking up as if to apologize for the necessary cruelty of understanding. On the roof, the astronomers marked a bright point and made a note that would, long after their deaths, allow another man in another city to discover that the heavens themselves drift. Precession, they would call it, like a slow, cosmic sleep. The library, on nights like this, felt invulnerable. It was not. But its vulnerability was its beauty. It was a gathering of mortal beings doing an immortal thing, teaching the future how to ask. When morning came, the rain sound began again, the reeds, the sandals, the instruments. Another ship's mast cut the line of the horizon. Another chest was hoisted up the steps. Another small beginning, folded inside a larger one, waiting for hands to open it. The lighthouse burned on, the city breathed, and the dream held. Every golden age carries within it the sound of its own ending, not as thunder, but as a low, persistent tremor that few can hear until the stones begin to crack. In Alexandria, that sound was not war drums or fire, it was whispers. The library had become too powerful to be merely a place of learning. Knowledge once shared freely, had become a currency, and every currency breeds envy. In the beginning, the city's rulers had adored the scholars. The library brought them fame and glory. Philosophers from every land spoke the name of Ptolemy with reverence. The kings of Egypt, descendants of Alexander's general, called themselves patrons of wisdom, and their portraits hung in the halls alongside statues of Plato and Homer. But over time, the relationship began to shift. The kings who once funded discovery now sought control. Curiosity, they learned, could not be ruled, and that frightened them. In the marble courtyards of the Mousillon, arguments grew sharper. Debates that once ended in laughter now ended in silence. The pursuit of truth was becoming dangerous. A new king, Ptolemy VIII, came to power, a man more suspicious than wise. He was known by many names, but one would haunt him forever: Physcon, the bloated one. He was jealous of the scholars who mocked his vanity behind closed doors. When he entered the library, conversation froze mid-sentence. He tried to charm them at first, offering stipends, patronage, banquets, but when praise failed, he turned to fear. He banished some philosophers, executed others, and filled the library with spies disguised as scribes. Words were no longer just words. They could be weapons. For the first time, knowledge itself became political. Outside the library, Alexandria still glittered. Ships came and went. Markets bustled. The lighthouse burned bright. But within the city, lines began to form. Greeks versus Egyptians, pagans versus priests, philosophers versus power. The scholars, once united by curiosity, began to divide. Some argued that truth should serve the state, that wisdom could survive only under a strong ruler. Others whispered that knowledge should serve no one, that truth was its own sovereign. That whisper became a movement. The Ptolemaic dynasty, built on Alexander's dream of unity, had begun to rot from the inside, and the library, that fragile miracle of reason, was becoming the mirror of the kingdom that built it. In one of the great halls, a mathematician named Apollonius of Perga lectured on conic sections, the curves of the universe. He believed everything in nature could be described by shape, by symmetry, by order. He drew ellipses and parabolas upon a slate and said, "Even chaos, if we could see it whole, has a geometry." But in the crowd, a younger scholar muttered, "And who decides what order is?" The room fell quiet. It was a question that hung over the library like incense, invisible, inescapable. Who decides what is true? The philosopher, the priest, the king? Every empire before Alexandria had answered that question with conquest. But this city had promised something different, that truth could belong to all. Now that promise was fraying. In the temple district, the priests of the old Egyptian gods grew restless. They watched the scholars dissect corpses and chart the heavens, and feared that the sacred was being dismantled piece by piece in the name of reason. To them, the library was not enlightenment. It was blasphemy carved in stone. Rumors spread like fever that the scholars kept forbidden texts, that they mocked the gods, that they sought to build new ones from mathematics and stars. One night, a group of young priests broke into a warehouse near the harbor searching for evidence of heresy. Inside, they found only scrolls, astronomy, medicine, poetry. But what they saw frightened them more than curses ever could. Human curiosity unbound. They set fire to the storehouse and fled into the alleys. The blaze was small, quickly contained. Few scrolls were lost. But the message was clear. The age of pure reason had ended. The library's leaders tried to ignore it. They told themselves that truth would always prevail, that the walls of marble and wisdom were strong enough to endure superstition. But cracks had appeared. Even among the scholars, jealousy grew. The astronomers accused the poets of stealing metaphors. The physicians mocked the philosophers as dreamers detached from the body. There were arguments over access to the archives, over funding, over who would be remembered. The library was a temple built for the mind, and yet it had become human, flawed, full of pride. By now, Rome was watching. Across the sea, the Republic had begun its long transformation into empire. Roman generals looked to Alexandria with both awe and suspicion. To them, it was a jewel, glittering, rich, dangerous. They respected its wealth, but distrusted its ideas. Rome preferred order to thought, conquest to conversation. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE, chasing Pompey into the harbor, Alexandria was already trembling from within. The Ptolemies had turned against each other, Cleopatra and her brother locked in a civil war that would decide the fate of Egypt. The library, standing close to the royal docks, found itself in the middle of a storm it had not created. Caesar, cornered in the city, ordered the burning of the ships in the harbor to block his enemies. Flames leapt into the sky, carried by the wind. The docks caught, the warehouses caught, and then, perhaps, the outer storage rooms of the library. No one knows how far the fire spread. Some say it burned only a small annex. Others swear it consumed thousands of scrolls, the work of generations. Eyewitnesses wrote of smoke rising so thick it blotted out the stars, of ash falling on the city like snow, of scholars running through the streets, clutching bundles of half-burnt papyrus to their chests. Imagine it, the smell of salt and ink and smoke, the crackle of burning parchment, the sound of pages collapsing into embers, words turning to ash faster than lips could recite them. The collective memory of mankind dissolving into the wind, and in the distance the sea, calm, unbothered, eternal. For the people of Alexandria it was more than tragedy. It was desecration. The library was rebuilt in time, yes, but something invisible had burned with those scrolls, the illusion that knowledge was untouchable. The scholars who remained wrote that night as if recording a funeral. One wrote simply, "The world forgets faster than we thought." In the years that followed, the library recovered but never quite healed. The halls were repaired, the shelves restocked, yet the faith that once bound its people together was gone. The kings who rebuilt it no longer believed in the sanctity of inquiry. They believed in control. The scholars who once shared discoveries now hid them. Knowledge became a guarded treasure, a weapon for those who could afford it. And in that shift, from wonder to possession, lay the beginning of the end. Still, there were those who refused to surrender. A philosopher named Carneades, visiting from Athens, stood before the assembly and declared that truth itself might be unknowable, that certainty was an illusion. He meant it as a challenge, not a curse, but the city heard only arrogance. The priests saw heresy. The rulers saw rebellion. When he left, they banned his teachings. Others followed him in secret. They gathered in small rooms, whispering that knowledge was meant to liberate, not to rule. Their words spread quietly, passed from teacher to student, seed to seed. Even as politics tightened its grip, the old spirit of the library lingered like perfume after the flame. One evening, near the water's edge, a poet named Stratonike stood looking at the lighthouse she had once studied under Callimachus, and now, older and forgotten, she watched the beacon flicker against the dark sea. She wrote a single verse on a scrap of papyrus, "The sea keeps what the fire cannot." The line would outlive her by centuries. The library endured, though smaller, humbler, more cautious. A second institution, the Serapeum, dedicated to the god Serapis, became its successor, housing copies of what had been lost. Scholars worked in shadow now, quieter, wary of kings and zealots alike. But Alexandria was changing. The golden age of open minds was over. In its place rose an age of guarded hearts. And yet, something miraculous remained. For all its pride and conflict, the library had taught the world a dangerous idea, that truth did not belong to the gods or the rulers, but to everyone willing to seek it. That idea could not be unlearned. The fire that had devoured so many scrolls had failed to burn the one thing that mattered most, the spark. It flickered still in the minds of those who came after, in the scientists of Rome, in the monks who copied texts by candlelight, in the dreamers of future centuries who would build their own libraries and call them sacred. At night, when the city finally slept, the ruins of the old library whispered in the wind. The waves lapped against the quay. Somewhere, beneath the sand, lay the ashes of what once was the greatest collection of thought the world had ever known. But even ashes hold memory. The sea carried that memory forward across ages and empires, waiting for the day when humanity would learn again what Alexandria had already discovered, that knowledge, like fire, can destroy or illuminate, depending on the hands that hold it. The library had not yet truly died. It had only learned how fragile light could be. The wind came from the sea that night, carrying with it the smell of salt and smoke. At first, no one in the library noticed. Alexandria was a city of noises. Shouts from the harbor, the clatter of carts on stone, the call of night merchants selling figs and fish. Fire was not rare here, but that evening something in the air felt different, sharper, hotter, like the breath of a god turning against the shore. Damon, a young scholar of astronomy, had been working late in one of the upper chambers. He was copying a chart of the stars from a Babylonian scroll, carefully tracing each constellation with red ink, when he felt the tremor. A vibration, faint at first, then louder. He looked up, thinking it thunder, but thunder does not carry the sound of shouting. Outside, beyond the marble columns, the horizon was orange. He stepped onto the balcony and saw flames blooming across the harbor, a line of ships burning in the night. Their masts glowed like torches. The reflection of fire danced on the Black Sea, and the air was thick with ash. From the docks came the cries of soldiers and sailors, the clash of steel, the chaos of men trying to fight a blaze that had no master. And above the noise, the faint, awful realization spread through the library like cold water. The wind was blowing inland. Damon turned and ran through the halls. The scholars were already gathering scrolls, shouting orders, scattering like birds startled from a field. He heard someone yell, "Caesar has burned the harbor. The flames are coming." The corridors filled with smoke. He reached the main atrium, vast, domed, endless, where statues of the Muses stood in serene judgment over panic. A scribe stumbled past him, carrying an armful of scrolls that burst into flames as a gust of hot air swept through the doorway. He screamed and dropped them. the papyrus curling instantly, blackening, disintegrating into dust. Someone shouted for buckets. Someone else shouted for prayer. The noise was too big for words. Damon looked up. Through the lattice windows he saw sparks, small at first, then larger, carried by the wind from the docks below. They drifted across the roofs like a rain of embers. The night sky was red, the color of sunset stretched into madness. He ran to the astronomy chamber where his teacher, Philetas, was still inside. The old man stood at his table, surrounded by scrolls, trying to wrap them in linen. "We can't save them all," Damon gasped. Philetas didn't look up. "Then save one." He handed Damon a single scroll, thin, delicate, sealed in wax. "Eratosthenes' calculations," he said quietly. "The measure of the earth. If the gods demand a price tonight, at least let them not take the shape of our world." Damon clutched it to his chest. Outside, a thunderous sound, like the sea itself roaring in, shook the ground. The fire had reached the lower warehouses. Barrels of oil, grain, and resin exploded in quick succession. The walls trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow drifts. The library was breathing its last. Philetas looked around the hall, the shelves stacked from floor to sky, the smell of ink and parchment and cedar oil. "For 40 years," he whispered, "I thought we were building eternity." He touched the marble wall with a trembling hand. "But nothing we build lasts forever, does it, Damon?" Damon shook his head, unable to speak. The old man smiled, not bitterly, but softly. "Then remember this. Knowledge dies only when the last voice forgets it." Another crash. The door burst open. Flames licked through the entrance like claws. The air turned to furnace. Damon grabbed Philetas's arm and pulled him back. The smoke clawed at their throats as they fled. Through the corridors they ran, past scholars trying to carry armfuls of scrolls, past others collapsing from smoke, past the statues now darkened by soot. Somewhere in the distance, a section of roof gave way with a deafening groan. The library was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. When they reached the courtyard, the wind was wild. Firelight danced on the polished columns. A group of scribes formed a chain, passing buckets of water that turned instantly to steam. Others tried to shield the shelves with wet cloths, but the heat was too fierce. The scrolls burned faster than the water could reach them. Papyrus ignites like breath. Each roll caught and curled inward, turning to black lace before disintegrating. The smell was unbearable, not just of fire, but of centuries dying all at once. Philetas coughed, stumbled. Damon half carried him toward the open air. Behind them, flames climbed the central dome. The great ceiling mural, the map of the stars painted in gold, cracked, peeled, and fell in fragments that glowed like meteors as they hit the floor. Outside, in the open plaza, hundreds had gathered, citizens, slaves, scholars, soldiers, all staring at the inferno that was once the mind of the world. The heat drove them back. Even from a distance, the fire's breath was suffocating. Damon turned to see Philetas sink to his knees. The old man was staring at the building, eyes reflecting the fire. "Listen," he murmured. At first, Damon heard only the roar of the flames. Then, faintly beneath it, something else. The sound of parchment unraveling, of scrolls crumbling, of countless pages fluttering open before they vanished. It was like 1,000 voices whispering their last words all at once. "It sounds," Philetas said, "like rain." He smiled once more, then slumped forward. the smoke too thick for breath. Damon caught him and held him until his body went still. Around them, the air shimmered with heat. Damon rose, staggering, clutching the single scroll to his chest. He turned toward the harbor, where the reflection of the fire ran across the sea like molten gold. The ships were gone, reduced to skeletons of light. The city screamed beneath the wind. He began to walk. Through the alleys, through falling ash that clung to his hair and skin, through the chaos of people trying to flee, he walked. Every step carried him farther from the burning heart of Alexandria, yet the glow followed him, a terrible sunrise that refused to end. By the time he reached the hills beyond the city, dawn was breaking for real. The fire had consumed itself, leaving a black scar where the library had stood. Smoke still rose, drifting eastward like the ghosts of unwritten words. Damon sat on a rock and opened the scroll. His hands were shaking, his vision blurred with tears and smoke. Inside were the markings of Eratosthenes, careful, elegant, written in steady ink. Numbers, distances, light angles. He read them again and again until the sun rose high enough to burn through the haze. He realized then what his teacher had meant. The library was gone, yes. The scrolls had burned, but the knowledge had not. It lived in him now, in memory, in voice. It lived wherever anyone remembered that shadows could measure the earth, that words could outlast kings, that truth was not stone or parchment, but breath. He looked back toward the city. The lighthouse still stood, miraculously unbroken. Its flame burned pale against the morning sky. The harbor was full of smoke and silence. A fisherman passed him on the road, leading a donkey. "They say the gods are angry," the man said, glancing at the smoke. Damon shook his head. "No, only men are angry. The gods are indifferent." The fisherman frowned. "And the fire?" "Fire," Damon said quietly, "is what happens when we forget to protect what matters." He rose, still holding the scroll. His robe was torn, his face streaked with soot, but in his eyes there was something the fire had not taken, a small, stubborn light. He turned north, toward the desert, toward the world that waited beyond the smoke. Behind him, the city that once dreamed of knowing everything smoldered in silence. Birds circled above the ruins. The air smelled of ash and salt and endings. But somewhere, deep in that gray sky, the same stars Eratosthenes had measured still shone. They had not changed. They did not mourn. They simply burned, steady, patient, eternal. And in their light, the last scholar of Alexandria kept walking, carrying the memory of a library that had tried to hold the universe in its hands. He would live long enough to tell its story to another student, and that student to another, until the tale became myth, and the myth became history, and history became a whisper. Yet the whisper would never die, because some things once learned cannot be unlearned. The library had perished in fire, but the fire itself had become its messenger. It carried fragments of light across the centuries, drifting from civilization to civilization, igniting new minds, new questions, new beginnings. And in the silence after the burning, the world finally understood what Alexandria had tried to teach. That knowledge is not kept in stone or scrolls, but in the endless, fragile, stubborn will of those who seek it. At dawn, the sea lay motionless. The same waves that had carried flames to the harbor now lapped gently against blackened wood, as if ashamed of what they had done. The air still smelled of burnt cedar and ink. Every gull that flew overhead seemed to cry for the dead. The city was quiet. Alexandria, the brightest jewel of the ancient world, had become a ghost of itself. When the first survivors walked through the ruins of the library, they did not speak. Their sandals crunched on a floor carpeted with ash. The marble columns still stood, ghostly white against the soot. The statues of the muses had cracked and blackened, their faces disfigured by heat, their hands broken away. Above them, the once golden dome had collapsed, leaving only the ribs of stone like the skeleton of a fallen beast. Where there had been laughter, debate, the rustle of parchment, there was now only the brittle sound of wind. Among the survivors was Damon, the young scholar who had carried Eratosthenes' scroll. His teacher, Philetas, was gone. So were half the men and women he had studied beside. He wandered through the ruins with a cloth around his face, coughing against the ash. Every so often he knelt to lift a fragment of papyrus. The writing burned away except for a few ghostly marks. Half a sentence, half an equation, a thought that would never be finished. He kept them anyway. He could not bring himself to leave them behind. On the far end of the main hall, where the astronomers had once charted the heavens, he found something strange. Beneath the soot and rubble, buried in a corner, the stone floor was cool. When he brushed the ash aside, faint lines appeared, the carved remnants of a star map. Even now, the stars endured. The same constellations that had guided the scholars still shone above the smoke, untouched by flame. The thought broke him. He sank to his knees, shaking with grief and relief all at once. That day the survivors began their work, not of rebuilding, but of remembering. They gathered in the courtyard where the colonnade still stood. There were perhaps 50 of them left. Scribes, translators, mathematicians, physicians, poets. Some were too dazed to speak. Others spoke too much, voices rising with feverish determination. One said, "We will rebuild it all." Another said, "We cannot. The scrolls are gone." A third whispered, "Then we must rebuild from memory." And that, they realized, was all they could do. They began to write what they remembered, not on papyrus, for there was little left, but on scraps of linen, on shards of pottery, on wooden tablets scavenged from the harbor. They wrote the names of authors, the titles of lost works, theorems they could half recall, verses that survived in their minds like songs from childhood. One woman, a linguist named Telesia, remembered entire passages from Homer and dictated them to whoever could write. Another, a physician, recreated from memory a text on anatomy he had studied as a student. They argued, corrected, doubted, but they wrote. "Every word we remember," Damon said, "is a seed." The library was a garden. It burned, yes, but the soil is still here. He didn't know if he believed it, but saying it gave the others strength. For weeks, the courtyard became their sanctuary. The city around them was rebuilding, merchants returning to the markets, ships docking again at the harbor, soldiers enforcing the new Roman order. But the library's survivors cared little for politics. Their empire was now made of fragments. At night, they sat around small lamps, reciting what they could. The sound of their voices filled the air again, quieter, slower, but still alive. It was not the library's old music, but it was music nonetheless. Sometimes citizens came to watch them, curious. An old fisherman brought them food. Children listened to the stories. A Roman officer even donated a few salvaged scrolls he had found in the harbor, still wet but legible. Among them was a fragment of Aristotle's Meteorology. When Damon unrolled it, The ink blurred, but one line remained clear. All things that are destroyed in order that they may be born again. He read it aloud, and for the first time since the fire, they smiled. Months passed. The ruins of the library grew silent again. The survivors had done all they could. Some left for other cities, Athens, Pergamon, Rhodes, carrying with them what they had reconstructed. Damon stayed. He could not leave the city that had shaped him. When winter came, the fires of the library had long been reduced to dust. From that dust, a new idea began to grow. Egypt's new rulers, Roman now, were practical men. They did not care for philosophy, but they understood power, and they saw that the scholars, though broken, still drew respect. Knowledge, even wounded, was valuable. A decree was issued. The study halls of the Serapeum, the great temple of the god Serapis, would be open to scholars. The temple's annex would serve as a new home for the surviving scrolls. It would never be as grand as the old library, but it would live. When Damon first walked through the doors of the Serapeum, he felt a shock of reverence. The temple was vast. Marble pillars carved with both Greek and Egyptian symbols, the scent of incense thick in the air. Priests moved in silence, their robes rustling like whispers. At the center stood the statue of Serapis, half Greek, half Egyptian, crowned with the sun and wrapped in serpents. Around him, newly built chambers waited to be filled. Damon and his fellow scholars brought what remained, the surviving scrolls, the fragments, the rewritten texts. Slowly, carefully, they placed them on new shelves. The priests watched, suspicious at first, then curious. Some even helped. For a brief, fragile time, knowledge and faith lived side by side. The Serapeum became more than a temple. It became a symbol of survival, the idea that truth could coexist with belief, that light could live beside shadow. Children came again to study. Debates returned, and though the halls were fewer and the shelves thinner, the spirit of the library flickered once more. Damon taught the new students by candlelight. He spoke not of certainty, but of perseverance. "What is knowledge?" he asked them. "It is not scrolls, it is not stone, it is the will to understand." He told them stories of the old library, not as a tragedy, but as a promise. "We are not the ashes," he said. "We are the flame that rose from them." And so, quietly, the work continued. Years passed. The world beyond Alexandria changed again. Rome tightened its grip. Empires rose and fell, but within the walls of the Serapeum, the scholars held fast. Some nights, Damon stood on the roof, looking out over the city. From there, he could see the harbor rebuilt, the lighthouse shining again, and the faint shimmer of the stars. The wind carried a faint scent of sea and ink, the smell of memory itself. He thought of Philetas, of Eratosthenes, of the countless voices that had once filled the halls of the old library. He wondered if they would forgive the world for forgetting them. He whispered a prayer not to any god, but to the muses themselves. "Let us not lose courage. Let us not become content with ignorance." Below him, students copied scrolls by lamplight. The sound was faint, rhythmic, steady, like rain. But even in its rebirth, the library's shadow never truly lifted. The priests of Serapis, though tolerant for a time, began to fear the scholars' growing influence. Religion and reason had made peace only on the surface. Beneath, the old tension simmered again, the same fear that had haunted the first library, that knowledge gives power, and power threatens those who crave control. Damon was old by then. He sensed the storm coming. He began to teach differently, less about facts, more about resilience. There will always be fires, he told his students. What matters is how we rebuild after them. And when the new priests began to question his loyalty, he smiled the same way Philetus once had. If truth offends the gods, he said, then perhaps it is the gods who should change. It was a dangerous thing to say. He knew it might be his last lesson. One morning, years later, he returned to the ruins of the old library. The sea breeze was cool, the sky pale and empty. The ashes were gone now, washed away by time, by wind, by countless tides. Only fragments of marble remained half buried in the sand. He knelt beside them and brushed the dust away. There, faintly carved into the stone, he found a few surviving words, almost erased, but still visible if you knew where to look. Let us seek what lies behind the stars. The inscription from the old astronomy hall. He closed his eyes and laughed softly. The fire had not erased everything after all. Some things endure not because they are strong, but because they are loved. When Damon died, his students buried him near the temple gardens. They placed beside him the scroll of Eratosthenes that he had saved, its edges charred, its ink faded, but still legible. Above his resting place they wrote, "He carried the world so that others might carry its light." The Serapeum continued for another century. More scholars came, more scrolls were written, more questions asked. The cycle of curiosity and fear began anew. But for now, for that brief window of history, Alexandria lived again. The fire had not destroyed its spirit. It had refined it. The library was no longer a place. It was an idea. And ideas once born do not die easily. They drift like embers on the wind, waiting for someone, somewhere, to breathe life into them again. The centuries rolled on like a tide. Empires changed their banners. Kings came and went. And still the city of Alexandria stood, older now, quieter, yet still holding a pulse of something eternal. The Serapeum, that last fragile heir to the great library, had become both temple and refuge. By day, it rang with the chants of priests. By night, it glowed with the lamplight of scribes. Faith and knowledge breathed the same air, though not always easily. To the outside world, the empire was no longer Greek or Roman. It had become something new, the Christian Empire, a world reborn beneath the sign of the cross. In Constantinople, emperors spoke of unity, of one truth under one God. But Alexandria had never been a city of one truth. Here, ideas refused to kneel. The Serapeum embodied that defiance. Beneath its roof, statues of the old gods still stood. The scholars who remained kept alive the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. They copied them in secret, hiding them behind texts of Christian philosophy, wrapping them in layers of metaphor. It was not rebellion, it was survival. Among those who walked its halls was Theon, an aged mathematician whose beard had gone white with years. He had studied under Damon's students and carried in him the unbroken lineage of the library. His daughter, Hypatia, had inherited both his brilliance and his defiance. She was young, luminous, and unafraid, a woman who taught men, who spoke in the public square, who believed that reason itself was divine. She moved through the Serapeum like a flame in slow motion, calm, bright, and dangerous to those who feared the light. Her lectures drew crowds from every corner of the empire. She spoke of geometry, astronomy, and the soul, weaving them together as if they were parts of the same equation. To her, mathematics was not numbers, but prayer, an act of faith in the logic of the cosmos. But outside the Serapeum, the world was changing again. The city that had once burned with curiosity now burned with zeal. Christianity had spread through Alexandria with a fever that neither reason nor empire could contain. What began as a whisper of hope among the poor had become the empire's creed, carried by emperors and bishops who saw no room for the gods of the old world. Temples were closed, statues smashed, scrolls condemned. The Serapeum became an island of resistance, the last place in Egypt where the old gods still had names, where philosophy was taught as more than theology, but isolation breeds suspicion. The new bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, saw the Serapeum not as a temple, but as a rival. His sermons thundered against it. No man, he preached, can serve both Christ and false wisdom. For what is knowledge if not temptation in disguise? His words spread like fire through the streets. To the citizens who had once looked up to the scholars, the old temple began to seem alien, a relic of pagan arrogance. Rumors grew. They said the philosophers practiced magic, that they defied God, that within the temple walls were idols soaked in the blood of sacrifice. None of it was true, but fear rarely waits for truth. The first stones were thrown by children, then by men, then by mobs. One morning, a procession of Christians marched through the city carrying crosses and torches. They sang hymns of triumph, but their faces were hard. When they reached the Serapeum, they stopped and looked up at its great marble steps. The priests barred the gates. The scholars, terrified but resolute, gathered inside. Theon stood with them, frail but unbending. "We have faced flames before," he said softly. "We know what they take and what they cannot." The crowd outside grew louder. The bishops had promised protection for those who renounced the old gods, but the scholars knew that surrender meant silence. Inside, Hypatia tried to reason with them, to open the gates and speak, to appeal not to faith, but to compassion. "They are not our enemies," she said. "They are afraid." But the priests refused. "If we open the doors," one whispered, "we will be erased." The mob surged forward. The siege of the Serapeum lasted 3 days. From the rooftops, the scholars could see the city they had loved twisting in chaos, icons and statues torn down, markets burned, people dragged from their homes for the crime of belief. The air was thick with smoke and psalms. When the gates finally broke, the crowd poured in like a flood. They smashed the altars, toppled the statues, tore the shelves apart. Scrolls filled the air like wounded birds, fluttering, spinning, catching fire as torches swung wild. The marble floor cracked under the heat. The great statue of Serapis, god of healing and knowledge, fell with a thunder that silenced the mob for a heartbeat. Then came the cheers. It was not the first fire Alexandria had known, but it was the most intimate. This time, the enemy was not an invading army or an accident of war. It was conviction, the certainty that one kind of truth must erase all others. When it was over, the Serapeum was gone, its priests dead or scattered, its scrolls either burned or looted. The air outside reeked of smoke and sanctity. Among the survivors, Hypatia wandered the ruins, her hands black with soot. She found her father's tools twisted and melted. A scrap of parchment still clung to a charred table leg. A single equation half erased the remainder of a lifetime's work. She pressed it to her chest. Her faith, not in God's, but in reason, did not die that day. If anything, it hardened. In the years that followed, she became the last voice of the old world. Her home became a school, her living room a sanctuary for those who still believed that thought was sacred. Christian students came to her lectures. Even bishops sent their sons. Her calmness disarmed them. Her brilliance humbled them. She seemed untouchable. But Alexandria once more was turning. The new bishop, Cyril, saw Hypatia's influence as a threat. To him, she was not a teacher, but a sorceress, a woman who twisted men's minds with logic. The mob that had destroyed the Serapeum still lived in the city's blood. They only needed a spark. That spark came in whispers. She conspires against the church. She keeps pagan magic in her home. She defies the will of God. And once again, Alexandria burned, not in flames this time, but in rage. One morning, on her way to lecture, Hypatia was stopped in the street by a crowd. They were not strangers. Some had once been her students. They shouted accusations, prayers, curses. She did not run. She stood in the sunlight, face calm, and said softly, "I teach what the world has taught me, nothing more." They didn't listen. By the time the dust settled, the last philosopher of Alexandria was gone. Her death was not just a murder, it was an erasure, the deliberate closing of the last door to an age that had believed knowledge could make us free. When the sun set that evening, the city was silent again. The Serapeum was gone. The scholars were gone. The voice of Hypatia, reason's final whisper, had been smothered beneath the roar of faith, and yet something in that silence shimmered, because ideas do not truly die. They change shape. They hide in the minds of those who mourn them. They wait. Years later, a traveler wrote of Alexandria, "Where once the world came to learn, now only the wind teaches, and it teaches grief." But others remember differently. In distant monasteries, monks copied the works of Plato and Aristotle, texts saved by those who had fled the burning city. In the libraries of Persia and Byzantium, fragments of Greek thought were translated, preserved, and passed on. Even in the Islamic Golden Age centuries later, scholars would speak of the wisdom of Alexandria, though none alive had ever seen its walls. The dream refused to die. It flickered like a coal, buried deep beneath ash, invisible but warm. And someday, when the world was ready again to ask questions, that coal would catch fire once more. When the wind sweeps through modern Alexandria, it still carries the faint scent of smoke and salt. Beneath the sand, beneath the layers of history, lie the stones of the Serapeum, charred, silent, and waiting. And above them the stars still shine, the same stars Hypatia once charted, the same constellations Eratosthenes once measured. They bear witness, indifferent, eternal, to the city that tried twice to build heaven on earth, and twice watched it burn. There are nights when the wind over Alexandria sounds like a voice calling through time, half prayer, half echo. If you stand on the hill where the Serapeum once stood, you can still feel it, the weight of something sacred that the world could not bear to keep. It is said that when the stars are clear, one may still hear a whisper among them, the voice of a woman speaking softly about circles, numbers, and the soul. Her name was Hypatia, and she was the last light of Alexandria. The morning of her final day began like any other, deceptively peaceful, the sun sharp against the white marble streets. the sea glittering beyond the harbor. She had spent the night revising her notes for a lecture on the movements of the planets. Beside her lay scrolls copied from her father's old collection, diagrams of orbits, equations written in delicate ink. She always rose early. Dawn was her favorite hour, the only time when Alexandria was quiet enough to think. Her servant, old and kind, brought her a bowl of figs and honey. He looked uneasy. "Lady," he said, "there are rumors in the streets again. They say the bishop's men are looking for you." She smiled faintly, setting down her stylus. "Rumors have no eyes, and I have nothing to hide." But even as she said it, a shadow passed across her heart. She knew the city was restless. The tension between the Christian authorities and her students, some of whom still clung to the philosophies of Greece, had grown unbearable. Yet she refused to flee. Alexandria had been her father's home, her classroom, her temple. To abandon it would be to betray everything she believed in. She walked out into the morning light, her robe simple, her scrolls tucked under her arm. The streets were crowded, but people moved aside for her. They knew her face, the philosopher who spoke without fear, the teacher who drew circles in the dust and made men believe they were divine. To some she was a saint of wisdom, to others a heretic in disguise. As she crossed the agora, children called her name. "Lady Hypatia, will you teach today?" "Always," she said, smiling. Her classroom was a modest portico near the old Caesareum. There was no pulpit, no altar, only a ring of benches beneath open sky. Her students, scholars, scribes, a few sons of nobles, were already gathered. Some carried codices, others wax tablets. She began her lesson the way she always did, with silence. "Before we speak of the heavens," she said, "we must remember what we are, shadows beneath the same light." She drew a circle in the sand. "This," she said, "is the universe, perfect, endless, complete. The gods, the stars, the soul, all move within it. Every point upon its edge is equal. Every soul is part of the whole." Her students watched, entranced. She moved with calm precision, her hands sure, her voice steady. Even those who disagreed with her, the young Christian scholars sent by Bishop Cyril to observe, could not help but be drawn in. "The world," she said softly, "is full of patterns. If you can see them, you can understand the divine, for the divine is not chaos, it is order in motion." A breeze stirred, scattering sand across her circle. She smiled and let it blur. "See, even when form fades, truth remains. Nothing is lost, only changed." No one knew that these would be her final words to her students. When the lesson ended, a group of her followers escorted her toward her carriage. She rarely traveled alone now. The city had grown too dangerous. As they turned down a narrow street, she heard shouting in the distance, angry voices chanting, the clatter of feet. The sound grew louder. Her escort stiffened. "Stay behind us," one whispered. From the alley emerged a crowd, not an army, not yet, but a mob. Men in rough tunics, faces twisted by fear and fervor. They carried crosses, ropes, stones. "Witch!" one shouted. "Idolater! Enemy of Christ!" Hypatia stopped walking. She looked at them calmly, though her pulse quickened. "I am no enemy of Christ," she said. "I seek only truth." But truth was no longer welcome here. The crowd surged forward. Her guards tried to hold them back, but were overwhelmed. She was seized, dragged from the carriage, her scrolls spilling into the dust. Someone tore the pages, scattering them like feathers. She fell to her knees. Around her, the air filled with shouts, curses, the crackle of torches. A stone struck her shoulder, another hit her cheek. Blood bloomed across her face. Still, she did not cry out. "Listen to me," she pleaded. "Knowledge is not blasphemy. It is God's gift." But no one listened. They dragged her through the streets, the same streets where she had once walked as a symbol of learning and grace. Now people looked away. Some wept. Others joined in. Fear is contagious, and Alexandria had learned to fear everything it could not control. They took her to the Caesareum, the great church that had once been a Roman temple. Its columns still bore scars from the idols torn down when the empire converted. There, in the shadow of those columns, the mob encircled her. The leader, a man whose name history would later forget, lifted his hand for silence. "You have defied God," he said. "You have misled His children." Hypatia looked at him, her hair disheveled, her robe torn. Yet her voice remained clear. "If God is truth, then He is not afraid of questions." The man's jaw tightened. "Blasphemer!" The crowd roared. They stripped her of her robes and hurled her to the floor. Someone raised a shard of broken pottery. She saw the sunlight glint on it, one last flare of beauty in a world collapsing around her. "Forgive them," she whispered. "They do not know what they destroy." Then the world went white. When it was over, the mob dispersed in silence. Even rage, when spent, leaves only emptiness. Her body was burned, her remains scattered, as though to ensure no trace of her could be venerated, no relic kept. But fire, as Alexandria should have known by now, does not destroy everything. By nightfall, word of her death had spread through the city. Some rejoiced, more wept, and in the quiet houses of scholars candles burned through the night, not for her soul alone, but for the death of something greater. Because when Hypatia fell, so did the last fragile bridge between reason and faith. Days later, one of her students, a young man named Synesius, returned to the square where she had taught. The sand still bore the faint outline of her last circle. He knelt and traced it with his finger, completing what the wind had erased. "She was right," he murmured. "Nothing is lost, only changed." He gathered her torn scrolls from the street, piecing together what fragments he could. Some were unreadable, others carried only single phrases, a line from Plato, a diagram of orbits, an unfinished formula. He wrapped them in linen and hid them beneath his cloak. That night, under the cover of darkness, he carried them to the harbor and gave them to a merchant bound for the East. "Take these to anyone who will remember her," he said. The merchant nodded. "And what shall I tell them?" "Tell them she taught us that truth is not fire or sword or fear. It is light." The ship sailed before dawn, its sails catching the same wind that once carried scrolls to Alexandria's shores. Years passed. The empire grew old. New wars came, new faiths, new fires. The story of Hypatia faded into legend, retold, reshaped, misunderstood. Some called her a martyr for philosophy. Others denied she had ever existed at all. But her students remembered. They whispered her name to their children. They preserved her teachings, fragment by fragment, thought by thought. Her legacy drifted across centuries like dust from the ruins of the library, small, almost invisible, but everywhere. In distant lands, when scholars spoke of the soul as a circle or of the stars as symbols of harmony, they were repeating her words without knowing. When monks copied Euclid or translated Plato, they were keeping her alive, Her voice became the undercurrent of civilization, quiet, patient, waiting for the world to listen again. In the present day, tourists still walk the streets of modern Alexandria, though few realize that beneath their feet lies the dust of two libraries, two worlds. The waves crash against the shore as they always have. The wind carries the same salt, the same whisper. And sometimes, in the hush before dawn, when the city is half asleep, it seems that the wind itself is writing, tracing invisible circles in the sand. Perhaps she is still teaching. Perhaps she never stopped. Her last lesson was never written down, yet it has outlasted every scroll. That truth is not a thing to be owned, but a flame to be passed. That knowledge cannot save us from cruelty, but it can remind us what cruelty costs. That we are fragile, and that fragility, not power, is what makes us human. As the stars rise over the sea, one might imagine Hypatia standing once more in her courtyard, the sand smooth before her, the air cool and endless. She draws her circle again. The lines gleam faintly in the moonlight. Around her, the silence hums with the promise of thought. And from somewhere far away, from every library, every classroom, every mind still reaching for understanding, her voice returns, clear as dawn. Even when form fades, truth remains. Nothing is lost, only changed. After Hypatia, silence fell over Alexandria, not the silence of peace, but the silence of forgetting. The streets that had once echoed with debate now whispered only prayers. The marble halls that had glowed with the light of oil lamps and inquiry were reduced to ruins, their columns half buried in sand. The harbor still bustled with ships, but the city's soul had dimmed. The lighthouse of Pharos burned on, but it no longer guided minds, only sailors. For the first time in 1,000 years, the world seemed content not to know. The great scrolls were gone, the scholars were gone, the temples were turned into churches, and the old gods' names faded into superstition. The art of questioning, the rhythm of thought that had once filled the air like music, was stilled. And yet, even as the darkness thickened, the embers of Alexandria refused to die. It began in fragments, the smallest survivals. A monk in Sinai, copying a psalm by candlelight, turned a piece of old papyrus and found beneath the faded Greek letters of a prayer a diagram, circles within circles, the remnants of a page from Ptolemy's Almagest. He paused, tracing the lines with his finger, feeling the ghost of a world his church had long forgotten. He did not understand it, not fully, but something in him trembled, the sense that he was touching the edge of eternity. He copied the psalm as commanded, but that night, when no one was watching, he copied the diagram too. It would survive another century because of that act of quiet defiance. Far to the east, in the deserts of Persia, the last scholars of the old Greek world fled Byzantium's suspicion and sought refuge among the caliphs. They carried with them the memory of Alexandria, the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid, written not in Greek now, but in Arabic. In Baghdad, the house of wisdom rose like a mirror of the library that had burned. Its halls glowed with lanterns and argument, its courtyards filled with astronomers and physicians who saw no conflict between faith and reason. There, under a different sky, the dream of Alexandria was reborn in a new tongue. The names changed. Eratosthenes became Eratosthenes. Euclid became Euclidus. But their ideas lived, Al-Khwarizmi would expand their mathematics, giving the world algebra. Ibn Sina would refine their medicine, healing with both science and spirit. Scholars in Baghdad looked westward and spoke of Alexandria as if it were a legend, a lost city of light that had once tried to map the soul of the universe. What the Christians had buried, the Muslims preserved, but time has a cruel patience. The house of wisdom, too, would one day fall to flame. Mongol armies would tear through its libraries, its books thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. The cycle repeated. Creation, brilliance, destruction, silence. The pattern that Alexandria had once feared, the rhythm of fire and forgetting, had become the rhythm of the world. In Europe, the silence grew heavier. The Latin monks guarded their manuscripts with suspicion, translating Greek thought through layers of faith. The names of the old philosophers became whispers, half condemned, half sacred. Yet even in the monasteries, the seed of curiosity sprouted in cracks. In Ireland, scribes traced geometric knots into the borders of illuminated manuscripts, not realizing they were echoing Pythagoras' theorems. In France, a friar studying the movement of stars rediscovered Eratosthenes' calculation, almost by accident, almost as if guided by memory itself. And in Italy, a young man named Gerbert of Aurillac, later known as Pope Sylvester II, found an Arabic translation of Euclid hidden among the treasures of Muslim Spain. He studied it in secret, tracing the diagrams by lamplight. When he became pope, he introduced the abacus and the concept of zero to Europe, tiny sparks of reason in an age of fear. He never claimed them as his own. He simply said, "I learned them from the East." He meant, though he did not say, "I learned them from Alexandria." Centuries passed. The Crusades came and went. Empires rose, burned, fell, and were reborn beneath new flags. Alexandria itself became a relic, a ruin whispered of by sailors, a name half remembered by priests. But knowledge, like water, has a way of seeping through even the smallest cracks. From the ruins of Constantinople to the markets of Venice, from the mosques of Cairo to the monasteries of Spain, fragments of the old library drifted like pollen, too small to be noticed, too persistent to die. A single manuscript of Euclid's Elements, copied by an Arab scholar, reached Florence in the 13th century. A translation of Galen's On the Usefulness of the Parts appeared in Paris 200 years later. Aristotle returned to the universities of Oxford and Bologna, stripped of his Greek accent, wrapped in Latin, but still alive. Each rediscovery was a resurrection, each book a voice rising from ash. And though few remembered where these voices had come from, their rhythm was the same, precise, patient, curious. The cadence of Alexandria. Then came the Renaissance, the age when Europe began to wake from its long sleep. Painters and philosophers, sculptors and scientists all reached back toward the ancient world, groping through the fog of centuries for what had been lost. They found not gods, but geometry, not oracles, but proportion, not dogma, but design. Leonardo sketched machines that might have made Ctesibius smile. Copernicus read Ptolemy, and then dared to surpass him. Galileo looked through his telescope and saw what the scholars of Alexandria had once guessed, that the heavens were not perfect spheres, but living systems, vast and unfinished. He did not know it, but he was looking through Hypatia's eyes. When the printing press arrived, it was as if the library itself had returned, not as stone and scroll, but as a million copies scattered across the world. For the first time since the fire, knowledge was free to multiply faster than it could burn. And still, beneath the triumphant discovery, there lingered a sense of something missing, a ghost at the heart of progress. Every scholar who looked back toward antiquity felt it, the gap, the void, the silence between what the ancients had known and what had survived. They called it the lost library. They imagined it as a paradise of learning that once held all wisdom, geometry, philosophy, medicine, poetry, the secrets of the stars, until one night it was swallowed by flame. They mourned it as others mourned Eden. By the time the modern age arrived, Alexandria had become less a city than a symbol. In paintings, it was always on fire. In books, it was always on the brink of rediscovery. Every generation reinvented it, not as it truly was, but as it needed it to be. For some, it was a warning about arrogance. For others, a promise that truth could never truly die. And perhaps both were true, because though no scrolls survived intact, the idea of the library had escaped, invisible, indestructible. It had traveled in translations, in footnotes, in the quiet persistence of scholars who refused to let the world forget. Today, the Mediterranean still breathes against Alexandria's shore. The city has changed, built and rebuilt across layers of its own memory. Beneath its streets lie the stones of the old library, the ashes of the Serapeum, the foundations of the lighthouse that once called ships home. In 2002, a new library rose from that ancient ground, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Its walls are glass, curved like the rising sun, its inscriptions carved in every language known to humankind. Visitors walk its halls unaware that their footsteps echo the same paths once walked by Eratosthenes and Hypatia. And when night falls, the sea wind returns, soft, endless, carrying with it the scent of salt and ink. If you listen closely, it still sounds like rain, the same rain that once fell on marble courtyards 2,000 years ago, the same rhythm that filled the air when scholars argued beneath torchlight, when scribes copied scrolls by hand, when a young student whispered a theorem to himself and felt, for a fleeting moment, that he understood the world. This is the long forgetting, not an ending, but a sleep between awakenings. For every age that forgets, another remembers. Every flame that consumes gives birth to a new spark somewhere else. And though centuries may pass between the rise and fall of such lights, humanity remains what it has always been, a species of seekers, haunted by the idea that somewhere, in some form, all truth is one. That was the heart of Alexandria's dream, and in every library built since, in every classroom, every whispered question, every mind brave enough to doubt, that dream endures. The waves still break against the same shore. The stars still shine in the same patterns. Somewhere, beyond the noise of history, a voice still murmurs, "Let us seek what lies behind the stars." Morning comes softly over the Mediterranean. The sea glows pale gold, the same color it must have been when Alexander stood upon this shore more than 2,000 years ago. The air is cool, salt-stained, ancient. Alexandria wakes, a modern city built upon layers of dust and dreams. No trace of the old library is visible now. Its marble has been broken, buried, reborn as new stone and new buildings. The streets have changed. The gods have changed. Even the light has changed. Yet something lingers, a hum beneath the noise of cars and footsteps, like the heartbeat of the world itself, remembering. It is said that memory never truly dies. it only changes form. Perhaps that is why, centuries after the last scroll turned to ash, humanity tried once more to rebuild the dream. In 2002, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened its doors. The new library is not marble, but glass and steel, curved like the rising sun beside the sea. Its walls are etched with letters from more than 100 languages, a hymn to every tongue that has ever tried to name the truth. From above, it looks like an eye gazing eastward toward the dawn. When the morning light strikes its surface, it flares white, and for a moment it seems alive, not a monument, but a memory made visible. Inside, the air is cool and quiet. Visitors move as if through a temple. The ceilings are vast, the stairways wide and fluid. Rows upon rows of books stretch into the distance. Millions of them, in every language imaginable. But the silence is not heavy. It breathes. You can hear the faint rustle of pages turning, the soft hum of computers, the distant echo of voices reciting facts or poetry. Knowledge here does not whisper in fear. It sings in peace. It is not the same library that once stood, and yet it feels like a continuation, not a resurrection, but a return to the idea that started it all, that wisdom belongs to no one and everyone. Standing on the upper balcony, one can look down at the readers below. Young faces, old faces, all caught in that same quiet posture of curiosity. The light from the sea pours in through the glass ceiling, scattering like water across the tables. It is as though the building itself remembers. The shadows of Hypatia, Eratosthenes, and the nameless scribes who once bent over papyrus seem to hover between the aisles. The smell of old paper mingles with the salt air drifting in from the harbor, and somewhere, deep in the subconscious of every visitor, the question that built the first library flickers again. What if we could know everything? It is not a question born of arrogance anymore. It is born of wonder, the same gentle wonder that moved a young conqueror to draw a city in the sand. Outside, the waves roll against the seawall. Fishermen cast their nets as they have for centuries. Children play among the ruins of Roman baths that sit atop Greek foundations that sit atop Egyptian stone. Alexandria is still a mosaic of the world, east and west, past and present, memory and invention. At night, the library glows from within. Its glass walls shimmer with reflected light from the city and the sea. To ships approaching the harbor, it looks like a lantern floating above the water, the reincarnation of the old lighthouse of Pharos, guiding travelers not through storm, but through time. If one listens closely, the wind carries a faint sound from within, the turning of pages, the murmur of voices reading aloud. The same rhythm that once filled marble halls now drifts through modern air. Somewhere, Hypatia smiles. The story of the Library of Alexandria has become a myth, yes, but myths, too, are forms of truth. They remind us not of what was, but of what must always be protected. Because the library was never only a building, it was an idea, the belief that the world can be understood, that the universe is not chaos but pattern, and that even in our smallness we can grasp the infinite if we dare to look long enough. It was a declaration of faith, not in gods, but in the human spirit. Every book we open, every experiment we attempt, every poem we write continues that declaration. We are still building Alexandria in fragments, in languages, in lights across the earth. There is a quiet moment each evening when the last visitors leave the modern library. The sun sinks, the sea turns silver, and the staff dim the lights one by one. The great glass roof catches the fading glow of the sky, blue softening into violet. In that hush, the building almost seems to breathe. The hum of air conditioners becomes the whisper of wind through marble halls. The turning of a page echoes like the distant rustle of papyrus. Somewhere, the faintest trace of smoke seems to hang in the air, not of destruction, but of memory. It is easy then to imagine that time is folding upon itself, that somewhere within these walls the old library still exists, not in stone or fire, but in the collective memory of all who remember it. Every story ever told, every question ever asked, every fragment saved by chance or love, all of it lives here, layered like sediment beneath the surface of the present. This is what remains. History likes to measure the worth of civilizations by what they build, but perhaps it should measure them by what they remember. Forgetting is easy. It is fire's oldest trick. Remembering? That is the hard thing, the sacred thing. It is what we do every time we write or teach or reach out into the dark and try to make sense of it. In remembering, we resist oblivion. In learning, we defy time. And in sharing knowledge, across generations, across oceans, across centuries, we recreate the Library of Alexandria, not in one place, but in all places. It exists wherever someone refuses to let silence have the last word. If the old scholars could see us now, the telescopes that pierce galaxies, the medicine that saves lives once thought impossible, the books that can be carried in light instead of ink, perhaps they would weep, not in grief, but in joy, because their dream survived. It did not survive in the way they intended, in marble halls or endless scrolls, but in something more powerful, in the human will to know, to remember, to begin again after every burning. Fire may destroy, but curiosity rebuilds. That has always been our true immortality. As night deepens, the sea outside the library grows calm. The stars shimmer, countless and cold. The same constellations once drawn by Eratosthenes, by Hypatia, by the nameless astronomers who traced the heavens on papyrus long ago. They still whisper the same challenge. Look up, measure, seek, and somewhere, deep in the rhythm of the waves, you can almost hear the old voices returning, gentle, proud, eternal. Nothing truly burns that is remembered. The camera of the mind drifts back now, over the harbor, the city, the quiet lights. The world below blurs into shadow and glow. The new library gleams like a second moon beside the sea. The narrator's voice softens, the cadence slowing like breath before sleep. Perhaps the library was never meant to survive, the voice says. Perhaps its purpose was not to hold all knowledge, but to remind us to keep searching, even after the pages are gone. And in that realization, the story closes not with loss, but with peace, because the Library of Alexandria was never just a building, it was and remains a heartbeat. The heartbeat of a species that refuses to stop wondering.